caught up in some appearances and getting carried away, then if you find it helpful, you can go back into the body and simply focus on the rhythm of the breath, anchoring yourself in the rhythm of the breath. Have that as your main object. And then a little bit in the corner of the mind, know that you're aware. before we go to today's practice, just a short review of some important points in the Shamatha practice. So in this Shamatha practice, normally it's said we are cultivating two qualities of stability and clarity, a stable mind and a clear mind. But I added a third quality that normally you won't see in the meditation text, and that is relaxation. And I think this is something we need to pay attention to, particularly in our modern society, because we tend to be very agitated and tense, and our minds tend to be very chaotic, and so normally whenever we want to concentrate on something we tense. So that's not going to be a very good basis for cultivating any sustainable stability and clarity. So the first thing we need to do is to learn to relax the body and mind. The more we can relax the body and the mind, the better this practice or any Shamatha practice will go. So really emphasizing relaxation. If you notice any tension arising in the mind or the body, even if you're well focused, release that tension. Release, release, release. Relax, relax, relax. And then in this retreat, of course, we're mainly focusing on three objects for the Shamatha practice: the breath, the mind, and then resting in awareness. And these have been deliberately picked because I think all three have their own unique benefits for us living in the modern world. And again, just to recap one recommendation regarding these three objects that Alan Wallace has, again, I'd just like to read and maybe comment a little bit on what he says on page 6 in his Attention Revolution book. To guide meditators along these 10 stages, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I have found effective for people in the modern world. These 3 techniques are the basis for the 3 divisions of this book. For the first 4 stages, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. And we'll be looking at these stages this evening. That's this evening's topic, these 9 stages. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continually returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. So for the mindfulness of breathing, we've introduced 4 variations in this retreat. The first one is the full body, very good for relaxation. The abdomen, particularly good for stability. The nostrils, very good for clarity. And then the rhythm of the breath, also very good for relaxation, and also as an anchor for the 2 practices of mind and awareness. By beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. In this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences, that is, all the events such as thoughts, mental images and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen or Great Perfection lineage. This is one of the practices in Tibetan Buddhism, particularly the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. So that's the practice we, of course, did the day before yesterday, observing the mind. Many of you probably found that more challenging than the breath, but some people really take to it very naturally and actually much prefer that than observing the breath. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. The technique is called Shamatha without an object. So this is the practice we did yesterday, of course. Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. And again, many of you maybe found that much more challenging than either the breath or the mind. But some people take to it naturally and again much prefer that to either the breath or the mind. The training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. You may use any one of the three methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So again, we can find an object that really works for us and just stick with that. Or we can follow this strategy. So maybe we want to observe the mind or rest in awareness, but we find it very difficult to get into those practices. Then, of course, what we can do is we can begin with the breath practice, any one of those variations, until our mind becomes more stable and clear. And then we can switch to the mind or the awareness practice and continue with those practices. So let's now have a look at today's practice. And again, to do that, I'll read from a quote from this text, Dzogchen text by Dujung Lingpa, from the great Dzogchen master from the 19th century. He says, and he's talking about these practices the last 2 days. He says, loosely relax and watch your thoughts from afar, clearly observing whatever arises. So that was the practice from the day before yesterday. That which observes is mindfulness, and that which is observed is called movement. So all of these mental events, of course, movements in our mind. And then he says, and resting in that state is called stillness. So that's the practice we did yesterday, simply resting in awareness, resting in the stillness of awareness. And then he says, identify them as such and meditate, meaning identify the stillness, identify the movement, and meditate through resting in stillness and observing the movements of the mind. And so that's what we're going to be doing now as to the practice for today, is we're going to start by resting in the stillness of awareness, and whilst resting in that stillness, we'll start to become aware of the movements of our mind. So again, the movements of our mind here is we're talking about mental events, so thoughts, emotions, mental images and memories and so forth. So we're not, again, talking about observing sounds and sensations and so forth. So let them be there, but we're not interested in this practice, only the mental events. So then, if we find that when we're doing that, again, we're just simply getting caught up in appearances and getting hijacked and carried away, then what we can do is just go back into the stillness. Just go back into resting in awareness until you stabilize a little bit more. Then start to become aware of the movements of the mind. But again, if you're finding that you're getting caught up a lot in those appearances, then put more emphasis on the stillness and less on the movements, and that way you can anchor yourself a little bit so you don't get caught up in them so much. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do, again, 2 15-minute meditations, and in each one we're going to start a few minutes of resting in that stillness, resting in awareness, and then we'll start to observe the movements of our mind whilst resting in that stillness. Okay. So let's do that practice. So again, 2 15-minute sessions with a 2-minute break. As always, we begin by preparing the body, setting it into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. Setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. The eyes at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. Simply release all appearances, allowing the mind to come to rest. not doing anything at all. Simply being present, knowing that you're aware. Resting in the stillness of awareness. Now, whilst resting in that stillness of awareness, start to become aware of the movements of your mind. Noticing any thoughts, emotions, memories, images. Without getting caught up in them. Observing the movements which arise within that stillness. And if you're constantly getting caught up in the movements of the mind, then go back more into stillness, meaning place more emphasis on focusing on stillness and less emphasis on focusing on the movement.